When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof, like Aloe or Allbirds, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and great marketing. But an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling, and for shoppers, buying, simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. Nobody does online business better than Shopify. It's home of Shop Pay, the #1 checkout in the world. You can use it to boost conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts going abandoned and way more sales going through to checkout. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income to upgrade your selling today. That's shopify.com/income.
The Presidencies of the United States is a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. Hello and welcome to the Presidencies of the United States. I'm your host, Gerry Landry. As this is a special episode of our Vice Presidencies of the United States series, I am joined today by my co-host, Alex. Alex, how are you doing today?
I'm a little hot, but otherwise doing really well.
Yes, we unfortunately made a new record yesterday here in the Charlotte metro area of 101 degrees in early July.
Yes.
Such fun.
Hotter than baked hell.
Yes. But we are inside today. We have some cool drinks, and we are going to have a conversation about another vice president. So, Alex, you remember the last time that we left off? George Clinton had passed away while still vice president. So we had the president pro tempore, William Crawford. But then there was an election because George Clinton died during an election year. And so March 4th, 1813 saw a new vice president come to the office.
Mm-hmm.
And this guy's name is Elbridge Gerry.
Gerry or Gerry? Are we going to get into that later?
So before we get into that, Alex, do you know anything about Elbridge Gerry before we get started?
Well, other than the fact that they have potentially linked him to the concept of Gerry, or in this instance, gerrymandering.
So it is gerrymandering, but we'll talk about that.
But it's spelled Gerry. But anyway, that's all I know is that they, have linked it to his tenure as VP, I believe.
Yes. Well, to him, but not necessarily his tenure as VP. But
in any event,
we'll get to that.
Right.
But yes, so just a note here, you may have heard the name, which is Gerry, pronounced as Gerry. For a while, it seemed like folks were using that, but with recent scholarship, I've heard more folks saying Gerry, and they think that that was how it was pronounced. Of course, it's one of those things. We can't necessarily ask anybody in the early 19th century, how did you pronounce this name? But that's what we think it was pronounced as. So we will be referring to him as Elbridge Gerry. But just know it's spelled Gerry.
All right.
And then gerrymandering is associated with him, and it's pronounced gerrymandering, just to make things confusing.
Because that's the way the English language rolls, right?
Yes. When there's a rule, there's always an exception.
Yeah.
And heaven help anybody who's trying to learn to speak English.
This is true.
And I say this as an English major.
This episode is brought to you by Allstate. Some people just know they could save hundreds on car insurance by checking Allstate first. Like to check the date of the big game first before you accidentally buy tickets on your 20th wedding anniversary and have to spend the next 20 years of your marriage making up for it. Yeah, checking first is smart. So check Allstate first for a quote that could save you hundreds. You're in good hands with Allstate. Savings vary. Terms apply. Allstate Fire and Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Northbrook, Illinois.
But with that, should we dive into our vice president?
Let's get it.
All right. So starting at the beginning, like we usually do, Elbridge Gerry was born as the third surviving son of Thomas and Elizabeth Gerry on July 17th, 1744 in Marblehead, Massachusetts. So
Nice town.
his birthday is coming up in a few days. His name comes from the fact that in May 1774, his mother Elizabeth had been awarded, quote, a generous legacy of £3,100 from the estate of her wealthy uncle, John Elbridge. So that's how he got his first name. Now, Thomas was originally from Devonshire, England, and immigrated to New England in 1730, where he met Elizabeth Greenleaf, who was either the daughter of a Boston merchant or a saddler from Marblehead, Massachusetts. Gerry's biographers disagree on her father's business, but he did something to make money.
Mm-hmm.
But at some point, either before or after they married, they ended up in Marblehead and ultimately had 12 children, though only 5 would live to adulthood.
Goodness.
So sadly, this is that time. Child mortality is a big deal.
I couldn't imagine. I mean, not even half of your children survive. That's just, anyway, wow.
Yeah.
Just rough.
Yeah, really rough. Which, meanwhile, Marblehead, which you said, nice town.
Nice town.
Now,
Yeah.
at the time the Gerrys arrived, it was described by Gerry biographer George Athan Bilius as, quote, a poverty-stricken town in a miserable state of decay.
Ooh, yeah, it's changed a lot.
Yes. Still, it was the 6th largest town in the 13 British North American colonies on the East Coast as of 1765, with a population of around 5,000, and was the chief fishing village, as well as, quote, second only to Boston in economic importance within the Bay Colony. Just wasn't too pretty.
No, it wasn't pretty. Okay, yeah.
But
maybe they spruced it up a little bit. Maybe that's why it's so nice now.
Yes. Yes. Well, and as we'll see, Gerry did get involved in public life starting in Marblehead.
All right.
So Gerry's biographer Bilius would write about the influence of the culture of Marblehead on Gerry's personality and political viewpoints, in particular the, quote, suspicious attitude by Marbleheaders toward anyone or anything strange or foreign, and, quote, their reactions to outside authority of any kind. So just have that in the back of your mind as we talk about him. So Thomas, his father, became a successful merchant and community leader, and by the 1770s, he, quote, ranked as one of the wealthiest men in the region. Now, his business focused on trade with Spain and the West Indies. However, he wasn't just a merchant. Thomas Gerry had a general store in Marblehead in which, quote, he sold retail goods imported from other colonies and abroad. His estate was estimated to be around $559,000 in 2015 U.S. dollars, which was more than the estate of, quote, any other person in the 5 surrounding counties in 1774. So they're doing rather well.
Yeah.
Despite their wealth, they were described as, quote, living simply in their rambling 3-storied home. Now,
Rambling 3-storied home.
Yeah. It's apparently, and living simply in it.
Okay, well.
So it wasn't a fancy 3-story home. But still, 3 stories, which with 5 kids, 2 parents, probably want a bit of space.
Yes, I would imagine.
Bilius attributes their austerity as stemming from Thomas Gerry's active participation in the first Congregational Church in Marblehead. His father's religious beliefs would influence his son in life. Now, young Elbridge's education likely began with tutors in Marblehead. Then, in 1758, he went to Harvard College at the age of 14. So this wasn't unusual at the time. You know, we think of college as being somewhere where you go, you know, usually 18,
Right.
late teens, early 20s. But at this point, they typically started in what we now know of as college. Earlier on, it was more of a prep school.
Prep school, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, you know, this wasn't necessarily uncommon. That said, we should acknowledge here that Elbridge was the only one of the Gerry progeny that went to college. His father proclaimed him to have, quote, a genius for schooling. Elbridge's paternal grandmother pushed for Elbridge to enter the ministry, but Thomas Gerry asserted that he planned to allow his children to, quote, choose for themselves what avocation of life they will follow, and would not push his son in any direction. At college, Elbridge's curriculum included, quote, classical studies, ancient history, and political theory. He pursued a master's thesis at Harvard and wrote about how colonists could evade the Stamp Act, which was a major issue at that point, 1765. So once Elbridge was done with his studies at Harvard, he returned to Marblehead and joined his brothers in the family's mercantile business. His education would serve him and his family well in this familiar setting, as he acted at times as the family's lawyer. So it's good to have that college boy back home helping the family. Gerry also took part in the social life of Marblehead, joining an organization known as the Tuesday Evening Club, which, as the colony's disenchantment with the British government increased, became more of a political organization for the elites of the town. As noted by Bilius, quote, the rising spirit of resistance in Marblehead manifested itself in a series of political moves during the mid-1760s and early 1770s, when the community vigorously supported its Boston brethren in opposing British measures. So this is the time, there's a big focus on Boston, but here you have these folks in Marblehead saying, we're going to stick with you. The young Elbridge and his family positioned themselves firmly on the anti-British side of the debate, both for ideological reasons as well as for business reasons. So this wasn't completely altruistic. One of the earliest points of contention, the Sugar Act of 1764, negatively impacted the family's merchant business as they imported Madeira wine, which would be more heavily taxed under the act.
And it's one of your favorites.
And one of my favorites. So boo to the British for doing that.
Right.
Gerry would also travel to other colonies on family business, and it was during a trip to New York that he chanced to meet a Virginian named Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson. Yes.
Teasy McTeaserton himself.
Old Teasy McTeaserton. He's in the picture.
All right.
And he would come to play a role in Gerry's life. So Gerry would be 25 years old when he had his first opportunity to serve in a public office. At a town meeting on May 10th, Elbridge, along with his brother, Thomas Jr., were elected to a committee of inspection to ensure that no incoming ships were importing British goods. So this is the point that the colonies are starting to pass non-importation acts. They're saying we're going to hit the British where it hurts. Though most communities in Massachusetts had loosened their non-importation policies after the British Parliament ended all revenue duties except for the one on tea, Marblehead and Boston decided to maintain their boycott, and Gerry would prove to be a zealous enforcer of the ban on importing and selling British goods in the town. So this is how he starts.
All right.
Now, sadly, the Gerry family would deal with personal tragedy in September 1771 when his mother, Elizabeth, passed away. So, they've already had the loss of so many children, and now the mother has passed away. Elbridge would continue his political rise with an appointment to a town committee to provide relief to the poor. Then, in May 1772, he was elected as a representative to the Massachusetts General Court, which was the colonial assembly. This new position would allow Gerry the opportunity to make the acquaintance of a man 22 years his senior, Samuel Adams. The two would form a strong political alliance, and Adams would be able to help guide Gerry in political strategy. Gerry became Adams's contact in Marblehead for a planned colony-wide network to coordinate opposition to the British government's objectionable policies. Now, Gerry, like other American Whigs, which is a catch-all term used for folks who are colonists who supported the Revolution, felt that there was, quote, a sinister plot against liberty being carried out by conspirators on both sides of the Atlantic. His remedy, as he shared with Adams, was to identify those involved and, quote-unquote, cut off their connections to the larger community. So he's calling for them to be ostracized. Ostracizing people. He had actually practiced for those who violated the boycott in Marblehead when he was on the Committee of Inspection. So this is something that he was familiar with. At this point, as noted by Bilius, Gerry's viewpoints on how to proceed were, quote, the more extreme and precipitous when compared to Samuel Adams's, as he advocated, quote, going directly to the people, while Adams, quote, wanted to work within the established framework of government, but to manipulate the structure in such a way as to advance his cause. So this is Gerry being more radical than Samuel Adams.
Wow.
Yeah. This didn't mean, however, that he was necessarily anti-monarchy at this time. Indeed, Gerry had a fear of, quote, the fragility of the Republican form of government. Particularly, it was a fear, quote, of power, naked power that might shatter a fragile republic. So this is something we're going to see with Gerry as we go along, and something that I think for folks who study him as well as his contemporaries was so difficult to wrap their heads around, because these things, he's calling about going to the people, but he's also not necessarily wanting to give all the power to the people. They seem contradictory, but to him, it all works.
Mm-hmm.
So these seemingly contradictions we're going to see come up as we go along.
Okay.
Now, at this point, Gerry and others felt that Parliament had too much power, and he felt that, quote, the encroaching nature of power might be contained by dividing it within the government through a system of checks and balances. So that's something we're familiar with, something that would play out.
Mm-hmm.
However, Gerry also saw, quote, a virtuous citizenry as a vital component for the proposed, quote unquote, free state for the colonies. The people should be involved in their government. While Gerry in 1772 still felt that it was possible for the colonies to exist within the larger British Empire, but with more autonomy, it would not be long before this viewpoint changed. Now, in December 1772, Elbridge helped set up an 8-member committee of correspondence in Marblehead, with his brother Thomas Jr. also serving as a member. That month, he was also one of 5 members of a committee appointed at a town meeting to take up petitions and grievances aired about British policy towards the colonies. And this is something in his early career. His brother Thomas was also involved in that committee. They seemed to be a good team.
Mm-hmm.
The committee reported out on December 15th, recommending, quote-unquote, strong measures against the British government, including endorsing recent measures from Boston. However, this endorsement would face staunch opposition at the town meeting on the 15th, but the Whigs would ultimately win out. Gerry won re-election to the Massachusetts General Court in May 1773, and this re-election put him in the colony's capital to serve on the Massachusetts Committee of Correspondence later that month, alongside his friend Samuel Adams, as well as John Hancock and other Whig leaders. So he's associating with some of the largest leaders at this point in Massachusetts.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Wow.
yeah, getting a good early start.
Right. Big Wig Elbridge. There we go. That's his nickname.
Big Wig Elbridge.
Yeah. I was going to try to play the whole gerrymandering thing, but with this different pronunciation, I didn't know if it would work too well. So Big Wig it is.
I was trying to think of a bridge too far. Elbridge.
Oh. But sorry, folks.
So it would be during this time that Gerry would develop his thoughts on constitutional checks and balances, as well as colonial militia, which he would share with Adams and likely others. The militia idea in particular was important at a time that the British troops stationed in Massachusetts were starting to adopt a more stringent policy, which, as Bilius notes, quote, made an open conflict almost inevitable. Beyond just the political and military issues between them, Gerry attributed some of the rift between the colonies and the mother country to stem from the fact that, quote, Britain had become rich, corrupt, and effeminate, and the English people, having lost their virtue, had fallen from glory as a republican state. America's environment still reflected those virtues required to retain republicanism, but the connection to Britain posed a corrupting influence.
Okay.
So, kind of harsh there.
No, yeah.
As matters were heating up on the larger stage, Gerry also got involved with efforts to combat a smallpox epidemic in Marblehead in the summer of 1773, because, of course, it doesn't seem like he has enough to do.
No.
Gerry would be one of 4 proprietors named to guide the construction of the Essex Hospital, quote, where persons could be inoculated against smallpox and then isolated until they became immune to the disease. Before too much progress could be made in construction, opponents attacked the scheme, claiming that it was a money-making scheme or that inoculation was responsible for the spread of the disease. In truth, it was due to the fact that the 4 proprietors were all staunch Whigs that drew the opposition. So, and we've seen this with other things. You know, we talked about the yellow fever epidemics, in particular during the Washington presidency, and how, you know, you had Federalist doctors saying one thing, Democratic, Republican doctors saying another. So this is a time when medicine and the approach to a public health crisis could be and often was politicized. And so we see that happening here. Ultimately, Gerry and his colleagues would offer to sell all supplies and the property for the hospital, quote, to the community or to any private individual, provided that the idea of a hospital was continued. So they were saying, you know what, we don't even have to be involved. We will hand it over to somebody, but we just have to have this hospital. I mean, we've got an epidemic on our hands. As no one stood up, they continued on their plans. And in early October, the hospital opened and several hundred people were treated. Still, claims that the inoculation was the cause of more smallpox cases continued for the next few months in what was dubbed the Smallpox War, and the proprietors were threatened by townspeople.
Okay.
So they're building a hospital to try and help the community, and they're receiving threats.
God, that kind of sounds familiar.
But wait, there's more.
Oh, Lord.
Finally, on January 15th, 1774, the proprietors agreed to shut down the hospital. And after tarring and feathering hospital clothing, rioters went to the hospital on the 26th and, quote, burned the building to the ground to avoid it ever reopening. Alex's face right now.
I'm trying to keep this G-rated, but wow. Just wow.
Yeah, they're a bit extra, aren't they? So
where to begin?
This is nothing new.
God help us. God help us all.
As can be imagined, this incident shook Gerry's belief in, quote unquote, the people. And he now started to see them as a potential threat to good government. As he wrote to Samuel Adams, quote,
I am not inattentive to the inestimable cause of American liberty, and while we are securing it externally, here happens an accident that pleads the necessity of securing it internally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we will see how this goes along and how this influences his political thought. But this is one of those defining moments in his career. And we see this, and it's interesting because we typically see it more in the folks who would later become, you know, the Federalist, thinking of the party. But this idea, the fear of the mob.
Yeah, especially when they're idiots.
When they're burning hospitals, you can kind of see some fear. Gerry resigned from the Marblehead Committee of Correspondence following the smallpox war. He's saying, you know what? It's been real. It's definitely been real.
Good luck fighting this smallpox on your own, G.
Yeah.
I'd be out.
He would not be away from public life for long, however, because when the British government heard about the Boston Tea Party, they passed a series of laws in 1774 dubbed the Coercive Acts, one of which was a new law closing the port of Boston completely, quote, until Bostonians paid for the tea that had been destroyed. It also transferred the customs house from Boston to Marblehead for the time being, which meant that Gerry's hometown became the key port of entry for trade in the colony. A delegation from Boston arrived in the city, asking the leaders of the town, quote, for an immediate boycott on British goods. But though Gerry was not able to convince the Committee of Correspondence to go that far, he did ward off pro-British forces enough to get the committee to pass resolutions against the Coercive Acts and in solidarity with Boston. So he wasn't able to convince them to go with this plan to, you know, just shut down the port, but they did at least say, we're against the Coercive Acts, we're supporting Boston. Meanwhile, he worked in the Marblehead merchant community to convince 28 of them, quote, to offer their storerooms and wharves free of charge so that Boston traders might continue to do business. So even though he's out of, you know, formal public service, he sees this as an important service that he can do with his connections in the community.
Okay.
He also took up a relief effort for Bostonians as other colonies shipped supplies to support the citizens of that city dealing with the crippling economic hardship caused by the port, their main source of revenue being closed, putting many out of work. So he's taking it on himself. He realizes things are bad in Boston. The port's closed. They can't get things in. They're out of work. It's getting bad.
Mm-hmm.
So Gerry coordinated the, quote, hundreds of people required to unload and process goods when they arrived. Then he facilitated the transportation of the goods to Boston.
Yeah.
By late June, Elbridge had agreed to rejoin the Marblehead Committee of Correspondence, which his brothers John and Thomas Jr. were both on as well. Now, sadly, we've got another personal loss as his father, Thomas Sr., passed away from pneumonia on July 14th, 1774. So while dealing with the relief effort for Boston, Gerry had also been the primary caregiver for his father during his illness, and Thomas's death caused Elbridge to take a temporary break from his public efforts. The family would ultimately settle Thomas's estate, and though Elbridge did not receive a large inheritance, as noted by his biographer Bilius, quote, he increased his inheritance many times over through his own efforts. So this provides him some finances that he can then take and use and build on for his personal success. But again, though, dealing with all this, he still wasn't away from serving his community for long. Though he declined the honor of representing Marblehead at the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia, he did attend the Essex County Convention in Ipswich in early September. Gerry was instrumental in getting this body to lodge a radical protest to the Massachusetts Government Act, another of the coercive acts that, quote, virtually annulled the provincial charter and stripped the Massachusetts towns of their most important powers of local self-government. The Essex County resolves proclaimed, quote, the Massachusetts Government Act to be unconstitutional and called upon judges, justices, and civil officers in the county to continue their duties as if the aforementioned Act of Parliament had not been passed. The resolves asserted that, quote, we hold our liberties too dear to be sported with, and are therefore most seriously determined to defend them. So he's a part of this effort that's saying, you know what? We don't really care what you say, Parliament. You and what army is going to enforce it?
Right.
Though Gerry had gone on the radical end at the Essex County Convention, when it came to practical governance, he was a bit more conservative. His biographer Bilius asserts that Gerry himself may have written the following statement from the Marblehead Committee of Correspondence around this time. Quote, the Committee of Correspondence of this place apprehend great danger of hostilities commencing in the province unless the people can be dissuaded from acting too much on their own judgments. So again, we have this idea, he's willing to go far, but not necessarily too far, and he doesn't want the mob to get things out of control.
Exactly. Can't say that I blame him.
No, especially when you look over and see the smoldering ruins of the hospital that he tried to build.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As a member of the Massachusetts Provincial Assembly, Gerry was present on October 5th, 1774, when that body, in defiance of the royal governor's proclamation dissolving the assembly, reconstituted themselves as the Massachusetts Provincial Congress. He was thus subsequently formally elected to this body, and as Bilius notes, quote, Gerry's election marked an entirely new phase in his political career. From this time forward, he was to serve mainly on the state and national level. So we've seen him acting in more the local level and kind of getting his start in Marblehead, but with this crisis looming and the connections that he's made on more of the, larger colony level, he's now moving into this new phase where he's going to have a larger role.
Big wig
Gerry. Gerry sat on committees, quote, to consider the state of the province, to consider measures for defense, and a committee organized to act as an executive body whenever the Congress was out of session. His membership in the second committee, the one for coming up with a plan for the defense of the province, meant that Gerry was able to push forward his idea for a militia force, quote, organized along local lines. When the Second Massachusetts Provincial Congress came together in early February 1775, Gerry was named, quote, to the Committee of Supplies, and one can imagine that his experience and connections as a merchant served him well as the committee worked to gather the war material that would be needed to defend the province against British forces. As soon as congressional sessions ended, Gerry made his way back to Marblehead to help with efforts, quote, to prepare local military defenses. So even though he's operating on this higher level, Marblehead still is home.
Right.
He wants to make sure that it's defended.
Yeah.
In the first couple of months of 1775, the town had to deal with harassment by both British naval and army forces. The town also had to deal with the economic repercussions of the New England Restraining Act, which not only threatened the merchant business, as New Englanders were forbidden from trading with some of their key trading partners, but also the fishing industry, as New Englanders were banned from fishing in the Grand Banks, their primary fishing grounds.
Mm-hmm.
So again, the British government is really trying to stick it to the colonies. They're trying to use economic coercion to get them to stop all of this.
Right.
Now, Gerry would find himself in personal danger when, as part of his work with the Committee of Supplies, he and other committee members went to inspect work being done, quote, to redistribute the colony's military stores in order to prevent any large loss from a surprise raid. This work meant that he and two of his colleagues were awoken the night of April 18, 1775, quote, by the sound of British troops tramping by on their way to Concord. That's right. He was there at Lexington and Concord.
Oh, wow.
Again, I said him and his two colleagues were awoken, and Paul Revere was nowhere in sight, apparently, and they just looked out and, oh, crap, that's the British. Realizing the danger of being caught, they, quote, fled into a nearby cornfield, and they hid in the shadows, laying, quote, flat on the ground, half clothed and shivering in the cold. Wow. But they realized they had to get out of there. They had to get hidden. They had to stay down. It was a good thing that they fled, as the soldiers did conduct a search of the tavern they'd been staying in before moving on down the road. So they could have just been like, oh, well, we'll just be quiet here. That wouldn't have worked. So they made the right call, even though they were half clothed and freezing. Still better than captured by the British.
Yes.
The search couldn't have been that thorough, though, as they, quote, left undisturbed a watch which Gerry had hidden under his pillow. If they would have found that, and again, you know, thinking about a watch, it could have had an inscription, it could have been something that they could have identified, they probably would have started searching for them in the area and may have been found, but luckily they didn't find it. Naturally, the famous battles of Lexington and Concord took place the next day, and a few days later, Gerry, back in the Provincial Congress, quote, was appointed to the committee to collect testimony on the way in which the fighting broke out. Recognizing the political importance of this propaganda move, he helped to draw up the account of the battle. And you have to imagine, you know, he had a little personal experience to add to it as well. But war was now a reality, and Gerry would soon play a role in determining whether it was merely a war of civil unrest or a war for independence. Because the war brought new opportunities for Gerry's star to rise in the political world of Massachusetts. With some of his colleagues, including John and Sam Adams, as well as John Hancock, traveling to serve in the Second Continental Congress, folks in the Massachusetts Provincial Congress turned to Gerry for leadership. And as noted by Bilius, quote, he responded to the new flood of responsibilities thrust upon him by showing a flair for administration which gained him the respect of his colleagues. Within the Provincial Congress, he concentrated his energies on four major areas: the gathering of military supplies, the forming of an American army and appointment of Washington as commander-in-chief, the building of a naval force, and the enlistment of support for the growing movement toward American independence. So all the big politicians are gone. Who do you get to lead the efforts?
Bigwig.
Bigwig.
All right.
So his experience as a merchant again came in handy when working to procure supplies for the military. Though he used his connections to secure goods for the cause in a way that blurred his public role and private business, it does not seem that Gerry ever engaged in profiteering. Gerry did what he could from Massachusetts to write letters to members of the Second Continental Congress urging the appointment of George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. And after this appointment took place and the general made his way to the Bay State to take command, it would be Gerry who organized the official reception for Washington.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Cool.
Yeah. So he's getting in with George W.
Big wig, big wig.
The importance of Gerry's efforts to push for the development of a navy took on a personal significance when, in December 1775, a British ship arrived off the coast of Marblehead and, quote, threatened to level the town unless it submitted to his, i.e. the captain's, demands.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, just gonna completely level a town. Ultimately, the British ship would withdraw when local men, after sending the women and children of the town elsewhere for safety, took up manning the 20 cannons in the harbor battery. Still, Gerry realized that such a move would only work for so long, and that the British would be back and in larger numbers. A naval force was needed if they were to win the war. It ended up that a vessel from Marblehead, the Hannah, became, quote, the first armed vessel fitted out in the service of the United States. Gerry also helped push through a privateering law in the provincial Congress. For his efforts, he was offered a position as a maritime judge, but he declined the post. So he's getting things done, and even though, you know, right now he's just acting in Massachusetts, these are big things. Yeah. This is a big part of the beginning of the Revolution.
And the beginning of the U.S. Navy.
Yeah.
Scene, right?
Yeah. In the midst of the beginning of the conflict against Britain, Gerry's heart did turn to love, as he fell in love with Catherine Hunt, the daughter of the man in whose home he stayed during this period of service in the state government. The relationship between the two would carry on between 1774 and 1775, but at some point drifted off when Gerry left the state service, and though he wrote long letters to her, as, quote, Catherine could neither read nor write, and was too embarrassed to ask her sister, who could write, to answer the letters, their relationship came to an end.
Oh.
Yeah, that's awful.
Yeah.
You know, he was sending her letters and she was too embarrassed to actually have somebody read them and respond.
Good Lord. And did he know she couldn't read and write?
I'm assuming so, but...
Wow.
Yeah.
That's really sad.
Yeah. Now, initially, Gerry was not a proponent of independence. Again, like we were talking earlier, he felt that there needed to be a certain degree of autonomy, but still within the British Empire. He felt that an accommodation could be reached with the British government, which would satisfy his requirements for the protection of American liberties. In October 1775, however, upon hearing news, quote, that Parliament had adopted a tougher policy towards America, including the enlistment of troops from Hanover or Ireland against them, Gerry began to consider whether they should start developing alliances with other powers and adopt a long-term policy towards self-governance. By the time he was elected as one of Massachusetts' delegates to the Second Continental Congress on December 15, 1775, he was firmly in the independence camp. And by that point, all of his fellow delegates, who were John and Sam Adams, John Hancock, and Thomas Paine, were also committed to the cause of independence. So they're presenting a united front for Massachusetts that they are for independence. His election did cause a political rift in the state, however, as he defeated a more moderate candidate, Thomas Cushing, who had served previously in the Continental Congress. Still, Gerry and his colleagues were sent back to Philadelphia with a mandate from the state legislature to do whatever they thought best, quote, for the establishment of right and liberty to the American colonies upon a basis permanent and secure. So they're like, do whatever you need to do. Gerry assumed his seat in Congress on February 9th, 1776, and would quickly become a strong advocate for independence. His biographer Bilius argues that Gerry's strong stance towards independence was not just about Britain, but also about, quote, preserving an already existing American virtue, and that his, quote, burning idealism to fight a two-front war for Republican virtue by checking vanity, vice, and folly from within, and by defeating Britain from without, goes far to explain Gerry's record in the Continental Congress and many of his seemingly erratic moves. So again, this goes back to, his contemporaries as well as later scholars are sometimes confused because it seems like he's contradicting himself, but
Right.
in his mind, it all works.
Okay.
And I think as we go along, you'll see some of that, and it may start to make sense. Much of Gerry's work would be done behind the scene in committees, but when he did have to participate in legislative debates, Bilius notes that Gerry had a, quote, stammer, which made him a halting speaker. So not necessarily great at the speech making.
Oh boy, a stammer.
Soon after arriving in Congress, Gerry was appointed to the Board of Treasury and would remain on that board until 1780, which Bilius describes as, quote, an almost unprecedented period of tenure in that post. By October 1776, Gerry was named as the chairman of the board and would take a leading role in trying to steer the new nation's finances. He would use this position to advocate for wage and price controls in order to protect American citizens of all socioeconomic levels. Now, for months, the debate would go on in congressional sessions, and Gerry launched a campaign, quote, to persuade the more reluctant delegates in Congress. Finally, on July 2nd, 1776, Gerry was able to write to his friend James Warren that the measure to declare independence had finally passed.
All right.
As noted by his biographer Bilius, quote, to Gerry, the signing of the Declaration of Independence was the most important single act of his entire life. It constituted a moment of immense psychological significance by creating for him a newfound identity. So here we have a signer of the Declaration.
Nice. Bigwig strikes again.
Bigwig strikes again. In September 1776, Gerry, quote, was named to a congressional investigating committee to visit Washington's headquarters near New York City to inquire into the state of the Army. That visit would be yet another time that Gerry was nearly captured by the British as he went out with, quote, some officers on a reconnoitering party. And when he set off on foot to get a better look, quote, the enemy discovered the party, and in the midst of the shelling, a cannonball cut down the tree to which Gerry's horse was tied, leaving his master stranded. So here we go again. Luckily, just like last time, he avoided capture so that he could write up the committee's report. Unfortunately, Gerry and his colleagues found many issues, and the report submitted, quote, became the basis for a number of important organizational changes. Gerry found himself in alignment with some of General Washington's main complaints about the nature of his command, including the fact that the force was composed of volunteers on short-term commissions, and that so many of the officers in his command were political appointees and ill-equipped to lead military operations. So,
Okay.
he's doing important things.
Yeah.
You know, he's helping to try and organize the military, trying to help Washington get things to where he needs them to be. And just as he had done in Massachusetts, Gerry used his family's connections in order to help supply the Continental Army. And at times, his family's mercantile business would be the suppliers to the Army, thus earning profits from their government contracts. Now, while this would be seen in the modern day as mixing his personal business and public responsibilities and a conflict of interest, at the time, this was seen as standard practice. The United States relied on the business connections of its leaders in order to sustain the war effort. They were like, whatever we got to do, we don't care. And though he and his family did at times personally benefit from this business, Gerry's biographer Bilius asserts that he was not acting as a profiter, but rather as a merchant committed to the war effort.
Okay.
But I do think that this may be something that we want to talk about, you know, when we get to the end, because, you know, we'll see how we feel about it.
Right. I kind of have my thoughts, but anyway.
So Gerry participated in the debates in the Continental Congress over the Articles of Confederation in the fall of 1777, and he helped to defeat 3 measures which would have altered the proposal in the Articles for each state delegation only having one combined vote in Congress. When the Articles were finally approved and it was time to sign, Gerry put his pen to the parchment and thus became a signer of that historic document as well. So he not only signed the Declaration, but also the Articles of Confederation. Gerry would play a role in late 1777 and early 1778 to assuage the fears of General Washington that a movement was underway in Congress to remove him as commander-in-chief in favor of Horatio Gates. So he's like, Washington, we got you. It's cool. It's cool. Gerry reported to General Henry Knox in February 1778 that he had found no evidence of this and that, quote,
the alarms that have been spread and jealousies that are excited relative to this matter appear to be calculated rather to answer mischievous than useful purposes.
Gerry's name would be wrapped into the supposed conspiracy by later historians, but his biographer Bilius asserts that there was no evidence that Gerry ever wavered in his support of Washington. So, again, this is one of those things, and I think as we go along, you'll see why folks may have suspected or may have started some rumors about him, but it just doesn't seem that there was any there.
Okay.
Likewise, Gerry would prove to be a staunch supporter of John Adams in Congress when Adams was sent abroad on his diplomatic mission and, like Adams, would prove to be critical of Benjamin Franklin, feeling him to be, quote, a pliant tool of the French court. So he's not a fan of Ben Franklin just as John Adams wasn't.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Indeed, Gerry's biographer Bilius notes that, quote, Elbridge's friendship with John and Abigail Adams reveals a side of Gerry's personality that has escaped most historians. It shows him to have been a loyal friend, a person of great sensitivity and charm, and one with a warm sense of humor. The Adamses did not suffer fools gladly. To remain a lifelong friend of the caustic John and protective Abigail required a tact that few possessed. And we will see this as we go along because, he's going to be involved with the Adamses for some time. And he remains their friend and a close friend and associate, even when John Adams had enemies all around him.
Wow.
Time to move? Skip the hassles of selling during the holiday season and sell your home directly to Opendoor. Request an all-cash offer in minutes, close, and get paid in days. You can even pick your close date so you can move after New Year's. Start your move at Opendoor.com or download the Opendoor app. Opendoor is represented by Opendoor Brokerage Inc., license 02061130 in California, and Opendoor Brokerage LLC in its other markets. Terms and conditions apply.
In December 1777, Gerry was appointed to the Board of War, which allowed him an opportunity to put into practice his concept of quote-unquote civilian supremacy over military authority. He also personally contributed to privateering efforts and pushed in Congress, quote, for developing a stronger American Navy. Now, Gerry suffered from a serious illness at some point in 1778, but he remained at his post in Congress, quote, so that the Massachusetts vote in Congress might count, as the state had stipulated that, quote, the vote of its delegation was not valid unless 3 members were present. So even though he was feeling like crap, he was like, just prop me up. I'll continue to vote. Old bigwig.
Bigwig.
In addition to his work on the Board of Treasury and Board of War, because, of course, he needed something else to do, Gerry was named in the summer of 1778, quote, to a committee to consider the condition of the country's finances. In September 1778, the committee reported out their recommendations for, quote, a policy of deflation for the continental currency and the securing of a foreign loan of £5 million sterling to serve as a sound money reserve for Congress's paper money, as well as other minor measures. Now, despite this, getting a consensus on what to do about the financial situation was a tall order, and by mid-May 1779, quote, Congress, at Gerry's suggestion, was devoting 3 days of every week to the monetary problem. So he is really pushing for, we've got to do something about our finances. You need to take this seriously. Gerry became infuriated at one point in early July 1779 when an anonymous essay was published in the Pennsylvania Packet attacking Congress's approach to the nation's finances, and he demanded in a speech on the floor of Congress for the printer of the paper to appear before the legislative body to answer for the essay. Gerry even threatened to leave Congress immediately if this was to be the way they were treated, but his colleagues helped cool him down and let it go. So they're like, dude, you don't have to get this upset over finances.
Yeah, Bigwig got a big temper.
Bigwig has a big temper.
Mm-hmm.
In 1779, when Congress began to debate which terms they would insist upon in peace negotiations, Gerry would advocate for the right of Americans, quote, to catch and cure fish on the banks and coast of Newfoundland as, quote, an unconditional demand, as this was a key industry back home in Massachusetts as well as in other parts of New England. On June 19th, Gerry delivered a speech to Congress outlining 5 propositions on U.S. policy on the fisheries issue. His third proposition, that, quote, any peace treaty with Britain should carry a stipulation that Americans would not be disturbed in the exercise of those rights to fish off the coast of Newfoundland and all of North America, would prove to be the most controversial and would lead to considerable debate in Congress. As described by Bailey as, quote, the fighting on the floor of Congress over Gerry's third proposition became furious and heated.
Mm-hmm.
In the fight over the issue, Gerry even threatened to push for disunion to ensure the rights of New Englanders.
Disunion.
Yeah. So, yeah, he was willing to break apart the United States over the fisheries issue.
Wow.
Which,
again, kind of overkill.
Well,
he's a little bit of a drama queen, isn't he?
Well, but it also speaks to, and this is one of the things, and we'll see this as we go along, because the fisheries issue would come up again in the War of 1812. Mm-hmm. And at that point, John Quincy Adams was the one really pushing for this and trying to help folks understand, yeah, I understand that you don't know this being from the West or the South, but in New England, this is a big deal. This is a big part of our economy. And if we don't have that, then what are we doing here?
Okay.
But still, disunion
that's a bit much.
Yeah. Now, Gerry was chosen to represent Massachusetts at a convention held in Philadelphia about price fixing in January 1780, but the convention did not accomplish anything. And by this point, Gerry was becoming frustrated with his role in Congress. The debate on the, quote, quotas of supplies and money being requisitioned from the states had carried on since October 1779, and in mid-February, Gerry argued before Congress for his, quote, motion to reconsider part of the report in order to reduce the Massachusetts quota. Moreover, he sought to restore the price codes on certain products in accordance with the levels adopted by the New Haven Price-Fixing Convention of 1778, a plan Congress itself had recommended. However, Gerry was to be ruled out of order, and his request for a roll call on the yeas and nays on the question of order dismissed. Because of that, because he was shut down, Gerry submitted his resignation from Congress in protest.
Dang.
He hoped that the legislative, quote, body would concede, reverse its ruling, and reinstate him to his seat on his own terms. He would wait in Philadelphia for months, but Congress was not budging.
Dang.
So he was sitting there just twiddling his thumbs. They're going to come any minute.
No, they're really not.
No, they're not. So thus, on June 3rd, 1780, Gerry began his journey back home. Now, funny enough, though he refused to attend congressional sessions that spring, Gerry was still consulted by congressional members, and he left Philadelphia with, quote, a mission by a congressional committee to visit the eastern states on his way home to discuss the status of the Continental Army with local authorities. So even though he was basically like, I'm not playing with y'all anymore, they were still like, well, can't you do us this favor? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Though his congressional service was at an end for the time being, this did not mean that Gerry was completely done with politics and leadership, because he continued to push the fisheries issue even out of office, corresponding with John and Abigail Adams, as well as others on the issue. To Francis Dana, Gerry again brought up the idea of disunion. Quote, should the want of a thorough knowledge in Congress of the importance of this right to the United States, or an inattention in this point to their interests on the part of our allies, deprive us of the fishery, the union and alliance so far as they respect this state, i.e. Massachusetts, will no longer be natural because repugnant to its true interest. So he's saying if they don't get how important this is, then what is this relationship that we've got because it's obviously worthless.
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, John Adams was able to report to Gerry in late November 1782 that the fisheries issue had been resolved in favor of New England interest in the negotiations with the British.
Oh, it's about time.
So, check that one off. Gerry, you can sit down now. It's okay. During this time, Gerry would agree to serve in the Massachusetts state legislature from 1780 to 1781, but he turned down other offers for public office. His colleagues in the state legislature put him forward again for a congressional seat each year from 1780 to 1782, but he refused to take a seat each time. Likewise, when Governor John Hancock offered him an appointment as Justice of the Peace for Essex County that same year, Gerry refused the appointment. He also refused 2 appointments to the state Senate. He's like, I'm kind of just good here.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this would be a time that he, besides just doing some political soul searching, he also reconsidered his personal finances. To this point, the mercantile business had been his primary focus, and indeed, it had proven to be a good one during the war. As noted by Bilius, quote, Gerry's mercantile career thus provided the basis for a large part of the independent fortune he made during the war. Earning commissions and profits on both public and private transactions, he amassed considerable wealth. His foreign trade, in particular, provided him with an advantage many merchants did not possess. So again, this may be something that we want to talk about once we get to the end, because he's making out like a bandit.
Yeah.
Though he would continue to have an interest in that with his brother Samuel Russell managing those vineyards when he returned to public office, and spoiler alert, he will return to public office, he began to diversify in the early 1780s. Gerry would now invest a good portion of his capital in government securities, then, after 1787, expanded into, quote, farming and local land speculation. As noted by his biographer Bilius, quote, although his pay as a public servant also provided Gerry with funds over long periods of time, it was never his main source of income. So he's saying, I don't want all my eggs in one basket. So in addition to this mercantile thing, going to do some land speculation, going to get into some government bonds, things like that. So he's trying to diversify his personal portfolio.
Mm-hmm.
But we mentioned John Adams's negotiations in Europe. The war came to an end, of course, because of the Treaty of Paris. And with the war over, Gerry's mind started turning more to how the nation was going to constitute itself. As he wrote to Mercy Otis Warren in mid-1783, quote, we have set Great Britain at defiance. We have weathered the shocks of war. We have hazarded all and waded through rivers of blood to establish the independence of America and maintain the freedom of the human mind. But alas, if we have any national character, what a heterogeneous mixture. We have a republican form of government with the principles of monarchy, the freedom of democracy, and with the servility of despotism, the extravagance of nobility, and the poverty of peasantry. So he's got some strong viewpoints there.
Yeah, a little bit. Just a tad.
So one can imagine that this was part of the impetus for Gerry agreeing to return to the Confederation Congress in August 1783. But he refused to consider it before he got proof that the state supported his stand. He was like, I'm not going back unless I know y'all have my back.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Thus, the Massachusetts General Court in October 1782 sent a request to Congress that they should, quote, inquire into Gerry's grievances that had driven him from that body in protest. Look, guys, he's been going on about this for years. Just go ahead and hear him out. Please, you'll do us all a favor.
Get him to shut up.
And we're sending him back to you. You can deal with him. So, with that done, he resumed his seat and his fight against, quote, the threat of militarism, which he saw as a two-front matter. Gerry sought, quote, to counter the rise of the Society of the Cincinnati and to reduce the size of the standing army in the regular peacetime establishment. So, we've already discussed his concerns about a standing army, but the Society of the Cincinnati was an organization founded in May 1783, which was, quote, composed mainly of officers with positions in the society eligible to, quote, be passed to eldest sons, a hereditary principle Gerry considered contrary to the spirit of a republic. So, Gerry was concerned. He's like, what is this group? This almost sounds like a nobility, that you're going to have titles that you can hand down to future generations. And oh, by the way, y'all are all military leaders. Great. This sounds wonderful. Gerry was also concerned that the members of this nationwide society, quote, wore ceremonial insignia as he thought it, quote, might result in the creation of a military aristocracy and lead to the overthrow of the republic. So, this is something, it's not just Gerry who's concerned about the Society of the Cincinnati, but this is why he's concerned about it. Gerry was even concerned about George Washington, who was the president general of the society. As he wrote around this time, quote,
when a crown is in view, who will answer for the patriotism of any man?
So even though he had been the staunch supporter of Washington during the war, now that the war's over, he's like, no. This guy could potentially become a king. We need to watch out for this. And now he's the president of this society that's going around, marching around in regalia. What's going on here? Though the society altered its charter in 1784 to answer the concerns of people like Gerry, the congressman from Massachusetts did not think that the changes went far enough to alleviate his fears. He would also find himself going toe-to-toe with a colleague from New York, this minor figure in American history that we know as Alexander Hamilton.
Frickin' Hamilton. Oh, my God.
Yeah. So Hamilton in late 1783 pushed for, quote, a modest standing army. Gerry was having none of this. He led the anti-military faction in Congress and would argue his point, not just from the standpoint of the dangers of a standing army to the national interest and the authority of the states, but also he said it was unconstitutional under the Articles of Confederation. Ultimately, his biographer Bilius asserted that, quote, Gerry helped to defeat what was the most ambitious attempt for a peacetime military establishment during the entire Confederation period. So he managed to slap Hamilton down.
I bet that felt good.
Oh, yes. I'm sure there are a few others who wish they could have done the same. The pro-standing army faction would attempt to raise the issue again in the spring of 1784 and would find some anti-military folks on their side for the simple fact that they wanted the army to take British-held forts in the Northwest Territory that had been part of the Treaty of Paris, had been given back to the U.S., but which the British refused to relinquish. So they're starting to say, maybe there is a use for this standing army. Though a committee that Gerry was a member of pushed forward a plan for a small additional military force to be authorized for this purpose, he would deliver a speech on June 2nd against a peacetime army. Ultimately, Congress would, quote, recommend that those states most conveniently situated to the western post and Indian areas send 700 militiamen into the regions where there are problems. As you can imagine, Gerry was thrilled at this. He loves the militia. He's like, yes, that's the way we need to go versus the standing army. So he finally got what he wanted. The standing army was, for the most part, disbanded. This militia force was sent. It was a highly successful term for him. When Gerry returned to Boston, October 1784, he began lobbying members of the state legislature to have that body come out with a declaration against a peacetime standing army. By the time the Massachusetts delegation returned to the Confederation Congress, they had explicit instructions from the state legislature, quote, to prevent the raising of a standing army of any number or any pretense whatever in time of peace. So no standing army, and he's got the state government backing him.
Okay.
Gerry's concern about a consolidation of power also extended to the power of the purse, and ultimately Congress would decide, quote, to run the Treasury by a commission rather than appoint one superintendent of the Treasury. So he is really concerned about consolidation of power as well as mob rule. Another important debate that Gerry inserted himself into upon his return to Congress was where the nation's capital should be located. Bilius notes that Gerry, quote, introduced the first officially recorded motion on the present site of the nation's capital when he put forward a proposal that, quote, buildings for Congress be erected on the banks of the Delaware near Trenton or of the Potomac near Georgetown. So Gerry was the first person to suggest that Washington, D.C. be built where it is today.
Oh, okay.
He was ultimately convinced to carry forward an argument that originated from the Southern delegations that there should be 2 permanent seats of residence for Congress, as he felt that it would, quote, secure the mutual confidence and affections of the states and preserve the federal balance of power. Again, this idea of consolidation of power he's against, and he sees this, having 2 national capitals as a safeguard to prevent both domestic and foreign influences from corrupting Congress. So by July 1785, Gerry was writing to John Adams, who was still in Europe at the time, that, quote, to be honest with you, I think America will, by being pressed by public and private creditors, be brought to reflection and discover that she has acted like a foolish young heir who, with a great fortune, has embarrassed himself by imprudence and extravagance, and after this, discover she will retrench her expenses, adopt a system of economy, discharge her debts, and then subsist independently and with dignity on her own means.
Okay.
Like a foolish young heir.
All right.
However, the tide would soon turn, and Gerry would see in, quote, the laxness of the states in sending representatives to Congress a threat to the federal union. So at first he was like, okay, I think things, we're not in a good place. They'll be better. But now he's starting to see some problems. He would write in a report in the summer of 1785 of his concern that, quote, the lack of adequate representation in Congress could lead, quote, directly to a change of our happy form of government, for others verging to aristocracy or even to despotism.
Oof. Well,
this report was too extreme for his colleagues in Congress to endorse, but it was clear that something was not working as it should, even if Gerry felt that it was a deliberate conspiracy to, quote, undermine the Confederation government. So he's actually kind of on board with the Confederation government, but he feels like people are not actually investing in it and may actively be working to undermine it. When presented with a proposal from the Massachusetts state legislature passed on July 1st, 1785, quote, that a national convention be called to revise the articles to grant greater powers to the Confederation government, Gerry and his fellow Massachusetts delegates to Congress refused to present the proposal to Congress, and instead wrote a letter back, a letter drafted, quote unquote, in Gerry's hand, which asserted that, quote, any constitutional convention enlarging the powers of Congress at the time would be dangerous and unwise. Instead, Gerry, with his colleagues' support, proposed that, quote, the only safe way to vest the Congress with more power was to do so on a temporary and limited basis. So, again, we're kind of seeing and I don't know if this is how you're seeing it. I know when I was researching it, I just came to this point where I realized Gerry's somewhere in the middle. He's looking for kind of moderation. Yes. He doesn't want to go one extreme or the other. He wants to walk that middle path.
He wants to walk it.
And I think that's part of what leads to these seeming contradictions, because he's trying to have the best of both worlds somewhere in the middle.
He wants his cake and eat it too.
Yes.
Big wig, you can't do that all the time. Just saying.
You can't do it all the time. The state legislature would drop this idea for now. So they're like, okay, we see your point. But as time went on, more and more people saw that something had to give, whether Gerry liked it or not.
And he probably wasn't going to like it.
Now, this, pushing back on the Massachusetts state legislature would be his last major act during this tenure in Congress, as on November 2nd, 1785, Gerry's term expired, quote, and under the regulations of the articles, he became ineligible for re-election. So they actually did have term limits in the articles. By the end of his service in the Confederation Congress, Gerry had put forward, either by himself or with congressional colleagues, 115 motions that had resulted in roll calls. To put this in perspective, so 115 motions, The next highest number was 43 motions.
Wow.
Offered by 2 other congressmen.
Good grief.
So this is his wheelhouse. This is his place. He's loving this. But not everybody is, and it seems like a growing majority is saying this just isn't working.
Mm-hmm.
While Gerry by this time was, quote, deeply conscious of his role as one of the founding fathers, and, quote, he deliberately fashioned his life with his place in history in mind, he was still also talking about, quote, his desire for a private life, for a wife, home, and family. So, we talked about earlier, he had, the brief romance, but it didn't really go anywhere. When he went back to Congress, they weren't able to keep it up. So he's still unmarried at this point.
Mm-hmm.
He's gone through this point
How old
in his
is he?
career. So at this point, this will be 1785, and he was born in 1744.
Okay, so he's like 41 years old.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And back then, that's like someone approaching their 50s.
That was unusual.
Mm-hmm.
So he's still unmarried at this point.
Wow.
But as early as 1785, there were rumors that Gerry was linked with Anne Thompson, the daughter of a New York merchant.
He liked those merchants, didn't he?
He loved the merchants.
Okay.
And see, I should have just looked at my notes because the next bullet point had his age.
Oh, okay. Well, there you go.
At this point, the 41-year-old Elbridge was over twice the age of the 20-year-old Anne.
Ooh, big wig, robbing cradle.
But this did not come in the way of their courtship.
Oh.
So he liked his younger women.
Mm-hmm.
On the evening of January 12, 1786, Elbridge Gerry and Anne Thompson were married at Trinity Church in New York City. It seems that theirs was a happy marriage, for as described by Bilius, quote, no matter how immersed he was in public affairs, he, i.e. Gerry, always found time to sit and unburden himself at the end of each day to the woman he addressed as my dearest life. Once they were married, the Gerrys moved from Marblehead to Cambridge, and in May 1787, Gerry bought, quote, part of the former confiscated Loyalist estate of Thomas Oliver, the last royal lieutenant governor of Massachusetts. His purchase included Elmwood, the sprawling Oliver mansion, and 96 acres of land. So he's definitely doing well for himself with that merchant. And then, we talked about how he kind of expanded his portfolio.
Yeah.
He's doing well for himself.
Well, especially with the potential conflict of interest that he's been having.
Yes.
Anyway, I digress.
Their new home was described as follows, quote, surrounded by scores of white servants, the Gerrys entertained a long line of distinguished guests in Elmwood. The mansion with its rich wainscoting, curved banisters, and great halls presented a scene of luxury. So a far cry from
The modest three-story
house
in Marblehead. All right.
As noted by his biographer Bilius, Gerry, quote, proceeded to operate the large estate and surrounding properties as a working plantation, though he would permit no plowing in the front yard at Elmwood out of respect for the Revolutionary War soldiers buried there. So, not exactly what you would want in your front yard, but at least he was respectful that, there were bodies out there.
Yeah, just a little bit. That's probably a good thing.
Yeah. No, let's
keep the bodies there.
Let's let them rest.
We don't want to dig anything up.
It is possible that his new marriage and working to get settled kept Elbridge from agreeing to take up an appointment as a delegate to the Annapolis Convention in September 1786. Despite the pleas of his friends, he cited quote-unquote private concerns as the reason he could not attend. Sadly, he may also have legitimately had other family matters to which to attend at the time, as his brother John, who was only 4 years older than Elbridge, passed away in Marblehead in February 1786, a month after Elbridge and Anne were married. So, this is a family that's very close-knit, both in terms of their personal lives, but also this professional business relationships. And so you can imagine that there was stuff to sort out. However, events would intervene to convince him to resume a role in public life. In the fall of 1786, an uprising of discontent, quote, debt-ridden farmers to shut down the Massachusetts county courts began, a movement that would go down in history as Shays' Rebellion. You may have heard of that.
Yes.
While it's beyond the scope of this episode to go into great detail about Shays' Rebellion, just that it disturbed many of the political leaders, not just in the Bay State, but up and down the eastern seaboard. We see so many leaders, including but not limited to George Washington, writing about Shays' Rebellion. At some point in 1786, Gerry had agreed to rejoin the Massachusetts state legislature, so he would be on hand to engage in debates in that body about the uprising. At first, Gerry returned his argument that he feared a more centralized military establishment than a group of insurgent citizens. However, his opinion would start to shift as events played out and the threat increased. And so we mentioned, this concern about popular uprising and the mob mentality that played out in Marblehead during the smallpox war. This ultimately led Gerry to support the governor's plans in January 1787 to send a military force to Western Massachusetts to quell the rebellion. So again, it's these shifting fears, strong centralized government, strong centralized military versus this mob mentality. And so he kind of shifts on the pendulum back and forth between which one he fears more at one point or another. Gerry would make his return to the national stage when he was chosen as one of the delegates from Massachusetts to what would come to be known as the Constitutional Convention, though he and many others arrived in Philadelphia in late May 1787 with the thought to just revise the Articles of Confederation. So Gerry is definitely one of those who comes, he's like, okay, we'll talk about some potential changes to the Articles, not knowing that people like Hamilton and Madison were coming and saying, we just need to scrap all of this and start fresh. And from what we've learned of Gerry, you can understand why he was really a fan of the Articles.
I can imagine.
It fits more with his political viewpoints, this idea of kind of decentralized government, not giving too much to the people, retaining power more in the states, but there is still something there.
Okay. Yeah.
But they were soon to learn that their colleagues had other ideas, and Gerry would spend the next few months debating the specific details of a new form of government. Now, initially, Gerry had wished for his wife Anne and their daughter Catherine, who had been born on March 1st, 1787, to be with him in Philadelphia. But as it became clear that this would not be a quick convention, and he was concerned about the summer climate there, so Philadelphia during the summer, he sent them to stay with his in-laws in New York. And he took up residence, quote, in a rented house on Spruce Street. As noted by Bilius, Gerry would end up being, quote, one of the most active participants in the entire convention, speaking 153 times in the course of 60 separate sessions.
Good grief.
He ranked as the 6th most talkative delegate in Philadelphia.
Wow.
So, we saw this when he was in the Confederation Congress. He is somebody who's going to be active in the work of this deliberative body.
But didn't you say his speech and delivery left a bit to be desired? So, interesting.
All right. But that didn't stop him.
Carry on.
Soon after his arrival, he was speaking out in an attempt to strengthen the central government without violating his instructions, which only allowed him and his fellow delegates from Massachusetts, quote, to revise the Articles. And again, this idea of the middle ground. Gerry sought a middle ground between Edmund Randolph's Virginia plan, calling for a new national government, and Charles Cotesworth Pinckney's objections that they had no authority to do so. So he's trying to find a middle ground. Bilius notes that Gerry, during the months of deliberation, was consistent about his concern about, quote, the convention's legal status and the fear that the government might become too national. Gerry opposed the direct election of representatives to the lower legislative house in addition to the upper house, as he aimed for more of a federal government where the states still had more power over who would represent them at the central government level. He was in favor of a single chief executive, but proposed, quote, a council that could advise the executive, and naturally, he did not feel that the president should be elected directly by the people.
Mm-hmm.
So, funny enough, something that becomes ironic knowing where he's headed and why we're talking about him in this series. At the convention, Gerry spoke out against the idea of creating an office of vice president,
Very interesting.
asserting that it was, quote, a violation of the separation of powers, and that, quote, we might as well put the president himself at the head of the legislature. So he felt that the vice president, being the president of the Senate, would somehow allow the president to assert more power on the Senate and on the legislature.
Okay.
Gerry also led the successful fight against the president having an absolute veto, and his efforts ensured that a 2/3 majority in both houses of the legislature could override a veto. Now, when it looked like the convention was on the brink of dissolving that summer without a resolution, Gerry worked to bring the disputing factions together to reach a compromise. As Gerry said in a speech to the convention at the time, if they failed in their work, quote,
We shall not only disappoint America, but the rest of the world. We should be without an umpire to decide controversies. What is to become of our treaties? What of our foreign debts? What of our domestic? It would be war and confusion, for the old Confederation would be at an end.
When the convention appointed a committee to develop a compromise solution, Gerry was named as the committee's chairman. Even within this smaller group, Gerry struggled to achieve a consensus. But finally, they prepared a report and all agreed to put it forward, and Gerry would defend the report in numerous speeches. In the midst of this debate, Gerry conceded on numerous points to achieve a compromise agreement, including on the argument of Southern states to have enslaved individuals count as 3/5 of a person for the purpose of representation in the House of Representatives. Yes, the 3/5 compromise. So that may be another point that we kind of want to put a pin on and talk about at the end.
Right.
Ultimately, despite all of his efforts in the majority of the sessions, Gerry would turn starting in late August to be, quote, an opponent and obstructionist of the work of the convention, and was one of only 3 delegates who declined to sign the Constitution. So after working so hard to build compromises, coalitions, to keep the convention together, towards the end of it, he was like, screw this. This is awful. I'm not signing that.
Dang. Maybe I should call him Teasy McTeasy.
Oh, bigwig.
Bigwig don't know what he wants.
During the last 6 weeks of the convention alone, he made 78 speeches expressing his opposition to the Constitution as it was shaping up. He also worked behind the scenes in, quote, private evening sessions with fellow delegates who shared some of his objections. But Gerry was unable to assemble an organized opposition to the Constitution before the convention approved the draft to be sent to the states. He explained in a message to the Massachusetts legislature on October 18th that he felt, quote, his powers as a delegate did not extend to the formation of the plan proposed, and that the Constitution had few, if any, federal features, but is rather a system of national government. And so very distinct differences between these two concepts of federal and national. National, more centralized. Federal, the states still have some authority.
Right.
Gerry also correctly predicted that the lack of a Bill of Rights in the new Constitution would be questioned and become a major point of contention against the drafted document. In the last days of the convention, he had unsuccessfully pushed for a Bill of Rights, as well as other measures, quote, to guarantee the personal liberties of citizens. Now, Gerry was attacked by a critic after his decision to not sign, who argued that the only reason he didn't sign was that the convention had not agreed to his proposal that the new federal government should assume the debts of the Confederation government as well as that of the states. The critic charged that Gerry, quote, had speculated heavily in state securities and then exchanged them for continental ones. So again, this idea that he's kind of mixing his public service and his private business.
Yep. That's definitely going to be a pin point later, for sure.
Yeah. Which, of course, Gerry denied this that, he denied these charges. He said that his decision was due to this idea of, he just disagreed with the form of government that came out. And to Gerry's credit, later research has found that Gerry had, quote, acquired his continental securities well before the convention and his state securities after it. So the timeline of things isn't necessarily working out for this to be true in terms of what he's saying. Did it have anything to do with it? I mean, everybody has a vested interest in having a stable government. So is that any more or less than anybody else at the convention? Indeed, his biographer Bilius points to Gerry's refusal to sign the Constitution as proof that he was not making decisions based on his self-interest, as the Constitution had much in it that would benefit Gerry and men of his socioeconomic class. So he was kind of shooting himself in the foot by wanting to keep an unstable government.
Right.
But with the convention at an end, Gerry returned home to Massachusetts and launched a public campaign to amend the Constitution. As Bilius notes, this was a dangerous prospect for Gerry's political future, as the Constitution was quite popular in the Bay State. One person at the time even predicted Gerry's quote-unquote political death. So he is out of step with popular sentiment in Massachusetts. However, we should note here, Gerry didn't campaign to reject the Constitution. At the ratification convention, he put forward numerous amendments to the document as drafted, but he wasn't saying, let's just reject it outright. We just need some changes. Now, this is an important point, as Gerry's biographer points out, because prior to the Massachusetts Ratification Convention, no other state ratification conventions had put forward amendments to the Constitution. But after Massachusetts provided this example, all of the remaining state conventions, except one, proposed constitutional amendments. So he's kind of blazing this new trail of how to approach, we can ratify, and here are the changes we want. But he did this, but it wasn't at all certain, and it didn't look like at one point that he was going to take part in the Massachusetts convention, because Gerry did not allow his name to be put forward as a delegate when it came time to elect people to the convention.
Okay.
So he had been launching this campaign, but he didn't actually want to be a delegate. Now, with that, he still received a couple of votes, but not nearly enough to be elected. So they're like, okay, whatever. But once the convention began, Gerry's old friend Samuel Adams put forward a proposal to invite Gerry to come to the convention to share his perspective as a delegate to the Constitutional Convention, which had drafted the document they were considering. They're
And
like,
he did.
Oh, yeah. He did.
It's just, I don't know. He's a bit wishy-washy. I'm sorry. That's just kind of what I'm getting from it. Teasy McTeaserton Part 2.
Old bigwig.
You don't know what he wants.
And it's understandable. I mean, you would want somebody who was involved in the crafting of this document to be able to explain, okay, well, what happened in Philadelphia? Why did this happen? Why did they decide this? So, Federalists agreed to this proposal. And that's the thing, like Samuel Adams was not a Federalist. He was an anti-Federalist. He thought that, inviting Gerry, he'd explain why this is such a bad thing. So sent an invitation to him. Of course, he came. Unfortunately for the anti-Federalist, as noted by Bilius, quote, his performance proved a bitter disappointment and testified to the political skills of his opponents. After ending up in a shouting match with a Federalist, in which they nearly ended up in a physical altercation. So here's that temper again. Gerry left the convention and refused to return. Instead, he wrote out his points in a letter to the convention explaining, quote, his objections to the Constitution and describing his role in the Philadelphia Convention. From his estate, Elmwood, Gerry received news of the convention's work in that on February 6, 1787, by a vote of 187 to 168, Massachusetts had ratified the U.S. Constitution, with amendments, of course. So that work is done. The Constitution is well on its way. Gerry was put forward as a gubernatorial candidate in opposition to the incumbent John Hancock in the spring of 1788, but he was soundly defeated due to Hancock's popularity in the state, with Hancock winning 80.5% of the vote to Gerry's 18.9%. So, sound defeat.
Yes.
Meanwhile, in late 1788, Elbridge and Anne Gerry's second child, a son, was born. Sadly, the son passed away in the fall of 1789, and we don't even have a record of his name.
Oh, my God. That's awful.
So he lived long enough that he probably had a name, but they just didn't think to write it down.
Oh, my Lord.
Or it's been lost.
Oh, that's awful.
Now, when congressional elections were held in January 1789, Gerry was put forward as a candidate. He used the opportunity to write an open letter to newspapers in the state to explain his position on the Constitution, and that he had only objected to, quote, unconditional ratification of the Constitution at the convention in Philadelphia. Gerry assured everyone that he was on board with the new government under the Constitution. So he's saying, I had some problems with, just as is, but by and large, I'm with the Constitution. And I'm actually standing for election to a constitutionally based office.
Mm-hmm.
In the first runoff, Gerry came second, but the top vote getter decided to withdraw his name. Gerry initially did the same, but decided against it. And when the vote was counted in the second election, he won a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. So his top opponent drops out, and he's like, you know what? I probably should too. And then he's like, but wait, hold on. I'm second. He was first. He's out. Yeah, no, I'm going to stay.
Again, Teasy McTeaserton.
And he won election. He wrote to his brother on February 14th that, quote,
I must go to Congress or render the state as disagreeable to me as to oblige me to leave it. For I will not live in a place where I can have no friendship for the inhabitants or they for me.
In addition to restoring his reputation, Gerry saw it as his obligation to serve the public by going to Congress. As he wrote to a friend around this time, quote, there seems to be a disposition in the dominant party, i.e. the Federalists, to establish a nobility of opinion, under whose control in a short time will be placed the government of the Union and the states, and whose insufferable arrogance marks out for degradation all who would not submit to their authority. So basically, he's seeing himself as the champion of federalism going to Congress.
Oh, God. Okay.
And with that, we are going to stop here, and we'll resume his life and career once we get to part 2. But Alex, just in terms of where we're at right now, the new constitutional government is going into effect. He's going to be in the first Congress. What are your thoughts on Elbridge Gerry thus far?
He's a very complex character. No question about it. I don't know. I mean, I can understand the complexities, but it seems like they're a liability at times. And I'm sure that will probably come to fruition more the more we discuss him. So it'll be interesting to hear.
Because at this point, we are at 1789.
Right.
He becomes vice president in 1813. So
Right.
We've got a bit of time ahead of us.
Some odd years, yeah.
And we'll see how this goes. We'll see how he actually gets to Congress next time.
All right.
For our listeners, thank you so much for listening. We hope that you found this part 1 of Elbridge Gerry's life and career fascinating. And we hope that you'll join us for part 2 as we explore his later career. In the meantime, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out. The email is presidenciespodcast@gmail.com. You can go to the website, presidenciespodcast.com, to find sources used for this episode, to find past episodes of the podcast, to find out how you can help to support the work of the Presidency's Podcast. And yes, there are numerous ways that you can do that. You can become a patron of the podcast. You can do a one-time donation at Buy Me a Coffee. You can help to fulfill some of the books on the wish list, on the research wish list, but also just leaving a rating and review and telling the history lover in your life. And we know there is at least one about the Presidency's Podcast if you haven't already. To all of you who have helped support our efforts over the years, thank you so much. We hope that you'll follow us on social media. We're available on Facebook, Mastodon, and Blue Sky as Presidencies, on the formerly known as Twitter at Presidencies89, and on Instagram and Threads as Presidencies Podcast. Alex, any last words before we say farewell?
Get ready for the Big Wig Part 2.
Get ready for the Big Wig Part 2. I couldn't say it better myself. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for listening. And until next time, stay safe and healthy. Be kind to one another, and take care, dear friends.
Hello, this is Gerry welcoming you to check out the French History Podcast. Our main show covers the history of France from the first humans until present. If you liked Mike Duncan's The History of Rome and wanted a similar program covering the land of beauty, culture, and love, we are exactly that. We also host world-renowned scholars who have delivered guest episodes on their specialties, including 18th century pirates, revolutionary booksellers in 20th century Paris, the special friendship between the Marquis de Lafayette and Thomas Jefferson, and numerous others. Learn what you love and listen to the French History Podcast today.